Welcome to the onboarding webinar of the World's Youth for Climate Justice. We are an organization who wants to bring climate justice to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. We want to put human rights at the center of the climate crisis. In this onboarding webinar, we'll talk you through our campaign and we'll try to draw the link between human rights and climate change. For more information, you can visit our website wy4cj.org, and we'll put it in the notes as well. And there you can find our handbook, some brochures, a 2-pager, and basically all the information that we'll be telling you today you can find more elaborately there. So for our plan of today, we'll go through why human rights, or how human rights and the climate crisis are connected. We'll give you an idea of how the movement started. We'll talk about what the International Court of Justice is and what advisory opinions do. And then we'll get into more of the details of the organization of World's Youth for Climate Justice, and we'll have a brief look at how you can get involved if you want to. So before we get started with the content, Yula, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Aoife. My name is Yula. I was born in Hamburg in Germany, and I joined World's Youth for Climate Justice a few months ago because I think the idea is incredibly important, and I'm very interested. This has never been done before, and it seems to be such an obvious way to take climate justice to the International Court of Justice, and so we're trying to do just that. I'm really excited to be a part of this very international and innovative group, and very ambitious and optimistic. Yeah, Aoife, would you like to introduce yourself before we go on to the next part?
Yeah, thanks, Yula. I'm Aoife Fleming. I'm UN Youth Representative on Sustainable Development for the Netherlands. So in this capacity, I speak to young people in the Netherlands, and I go with the Dutch delegation to COPs, and this is where I met the students who started the movement. And basically from that moment on, I've been involved, and I try to really, in the work that I do as youth representative, I try to integrate a human rights approach. All right, let's get started. So we are a movement that, we are an international movement, and at the moment we have representation in many continents. We are working in, we have strong representation in the Caribbean, in Europe, in the Philippines, and in the Pacific. And it's actually the students from the Pacific who started the movement. They were following a law course, and they were discussing with their professor how they can respond, how they can use international law to respond to the climate crisis. And in the Pacific, the effects of the climate crisis are felt most acutely. There are a lot of island states there who are slowly sinking and who are facing more extreme weather events due to climate change. So they wanted to use international law as a tool to address this, and their professor told them about an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, and they thought this was a great idea, and they started campaigning. And their movement has grown not only in the Pacific, but also to many other parts of the world. And that's how we joined the movement, and also how the World's Youth for Climate Justice has come about as an umbrella organization of all these different continents.
Yeah, it is very important to us that human rights and the climate crisis are seen as what they are. They're closely interconnected. Human rights, so many different human rights are affected by not just the direct consequences of climate change, the natural disasters, for example, but also some of the more they're called slow onset events. So those changes that will happen very slowly. So it's less rainfalls, some crops won't grow, people's right to food, for example, will be violated. So there are loads of different rights that are affected in various ways, and some already today, and some will be affected in other parts of the world in a few years. We know this, and it's well established, and in academic circles and in activist circles that human rights are being violated today, and will continue to do so in the future. So this is something, unfortunately, that has not reached all political circles yet. And human rights continues to be an issue that people tiptoe around, especially at the UN spaces. There are certain countries who tend to avoid strong human rights language in international climate change agreements. And that's why we hope that the International Court of Justice will not just reaffirm that there is a connection between human rights obligations and the climate crisis, but will also issue a more activist advisory opinion outlining what obligations states have to protect the human rights of current and future generations. Because there are obligations, so this is not something we're making up, but all these different human rights obligations, the right to housing, the right to health, the right to life, for example, those are obligations that are all anchored in different international agreements. So agreements where states said agreements they signed voluntarily. Some, for example, are regional, so the European Convention on Human Rights, for example, but there are international human rights treaties as well that states joined, and so they have these these obligations under international law. And we're now hoping that the International Court of Justice will pull all these obligations from different treaties and issue one authoritative opinion on what obligations states have.
Yes, and this is the fact that we're focusing on human rights is also built on multiple years of work of people that came before us. So it was actually Palau that started the initiative for an advisory opinion in 2011. And they wanted to, 2011 was before the Paris Agreement, and they wanted to bring an advisory opinion, request the advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on what obligations states have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Because in 2011, without the Paris Agreement, it was there was a completely different political landscape where countries were not working together and they were not agreeing on limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So they believe that an advisory opinion could clarify these obligations that states have to stop climate change. So a lot of work has been done then through Palau, through the diplomats of Palau, through academics, through campaigners who were really invested in this movement, and we're building on their work in this new initiative for an advisory opinion, which also focuses on climate change, but then from a human rights perspective, because now we have the Paris Agreement and we know that states have to submit more ambitious plans to the UN every 5 years. So they have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to be in line with the Paris Agreement. But still, in the Paris Agreement and in the convention that came before that, there is very minimal reference to human rights. So that's really why we're choosing this human rights language, to draw the connection between the climate crisis and the impacts that human rights that it has on human rights. So we're building on the work of many people that came before us, and at the same time we have a new approach to it. So to get into the more nitty-gritty stuff of how requesting an advisory opinion works, is that the International Court of Justice is the court of the UN. It's one of the UN organs. So the only way to request an advisory opinion is through another UN organ. So that could be either the Security Council or the General Assembly, or specialized agencies such as the WHO, the World Health Organization. But we want the General Assembly to request the advisory opinion, and we want this for several reasons. Because the General Assembly is concerned with all political matters instead of only health, as the World Health Organization is. and all countries are represented there. So we think it carries a lot of legitimacy if all UN member states would vote on this matter instead of only the countries that are represented in the Security Council. So if the General Assembly were to request an advisory opinion, they would have to pass a resolution with a simple majority. So the General Assembly counts 193 states. So 97 states would have to vote in favor if no countries are abstaining. Then what happens then is that if the resolution is passed, then it's sent to the International Court of Justice and they start their own proceedings, and the court has some preliminary questions before they get to the content of human rights and climate change. So for example, they would have to determine whether they have jurisdiction, whether they use their discretion not to answer the question. But we think since this is such a global issue with so many lives at stake, it would these preliminary questions would not be a problem, and the court would be able to give an opinion on climate change and human rights.
Yes, this is a picture of the Peace Palace in The Hague. This is where the judges sit and where they will meet while they consider and continue to draft the advisory opinion. The ICJ has in the past issued advisory opinions at 28 different on 28 different issues, and the majority of these 28 advisory opinions have been requested by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And those advisory opinions, it's a very long document when it comes out, and it's not binding. So the ICJ doesn't have a police force that comes out to force countries to implement whatever is contained in the advisory opinion. That's why it's called an opinion. It's not a law, but it does have it has a great moral and legal authority. The judges who sit in those courts have been nominated to sit there because of their expertise. They've been judges for a really long time, and they are considered the world's court, so the highest instance in the entire world, the Court of the United Nations. So whatever they will decide can be considered to be the most authoritative source of law. And a lot of national courts will refer to whatever the ICJ has said when they're dealing with cases on a national level. So the Dutch Supreme Court, for example, might consider what the advisory opinion says. And in the past, the advisory opinions that the ICJ has issued have led to international negotiations on treaties, for example. It made very clear that nuclear weapons, for example, were illegal under international law. So they have a great power. The advisory opinion can send a great message out there in the world, to the world. And we need an advisory opinion for several different reasons. And we've outlined them on the slide briefly. So what we're looking to do is to cement scientific consensus on the climate crisis. So right now, if you're watching this video, then you're probably on our side. You know, climate change and the climate crisis is a real issue, yet sometimes in certain courts, it seems to be difficult to just get the science straight, to just have everyone recognize that climate change was caused by human activity, or the level of global temperature increase, for example, was caused because of human intervention, human interference. So we're looking to just create consensus if the highest court of the world, for example, considers the IPCC reports as an authoritative source of climate science. We hope, instead of undermining the Paris Agreement, we hope to be able to encourage more ambitious action by states. So Aoife has spoken about the NDC, so what states will contribute, how they reduce their emissions, for example. We hope that this will only encourage states. We hope that this can provide guidance for courts at all levels. So what I've mentioned before, that Supreme Courts, for example, will look at the ICJ for guidance on questions of climate change and human rights. We hope that climate change law and human rights law will be able to be integrated more on an international level And we hope that we can encourage international collaboration and support in mitigation. So that means reducing emission, adaptation. How do we adapt to the changes that are inevitably going to happen, and international collaboration on loss and damage.
All right. If you're there are a few risks involved with requesting the advisory opinion, and there are some counter arguments that you might hear when you talk to people about requesting an advisory opinion. So we wanna go through the most heard ones and how you could respond to them. So, for example, there's the legitimacy objection, where people might say the most legitimate way is if countries come together, for example, at the COPs, at the climate negotiations, to together agree on integrating human rights into the climate change regime. But this is it's seen that we've seen that from the early 90s, states have consequently rejected to include human rights language in the treaty. So it's very unlikely that within the next few years, countries will decide to start integrating human rights language. So it's the urgency of the climate crisis is really too big to be able to wait until all countries are on board with integrating human rights language, and the climate crisis is really a human rights issue. So we think that we cannot wait for that to happen, and the court has to. The court, therefore, is very well placed to step in and to clarify the obligations there. Then there's the issue of public participation during the proceedings. So at the International Court of Justice, since it's the UN court, only states can be represented and they can participate in the proceedings. So it's states who get to do submissions, who get speaking time. And since we're talking about the climate crisis in relation to human rights, it could feel unfair that the victims, the most affected people, could not participate in the proceedings. But we've seen that in the past, for example, in the nuclear weapons advisory opinion, that states have granted their speaking time to victims to be able to share their story of how they are affected. And we've also seen that submissions from states have been written in collaboration with international organizations and with non-governmental organizations. So we think that even within the structure of the ICJ, there is room for the victims and the people most affected by the climate crisis to be able to contribute as well. Then thirdly, the issue that you might hear is that an advisory opinion would reduce the negotiation space that states have, and that it would undermine the Paris Agreement. But we think this is not a risk, since it's not a competition. It's not either we do the advisory opinion or states continue to negotiate. It's really the climate crisis is such an overwhelming problem that we need all hands on deck, and it's these two paths can happen next to each other, and it would probably be very good if the two would actually also intersect. That if there is an advisory opinion on human rights and climate change, that states would take this into account in the negotiations, and they would actually be able to learn from and draw upon the thoughts of the ICJ in that. And we also think that therefore it will not undermine the Paris Agreement, but it will actually enhance it, for example, by clarifying the human rights obligations, which are basically non-existent in the human rights or in the Paris Agreement, that an advisory opinion would be able to clarify that and therefore strengthen it rather than reduce its force.
As Aoife mentioned in the beginning, we consider ourselves an umbrella organization. So there are loads of different partners we are already working with, and we hope to increase the number of partners and expand to all parts of the world. Currently, we've looked at a map before with the different groups in different parts of the world, and the role of World's Youth for Climate Justice is to provide these different regional, local, national groups with resources that they need, knowledge and information, advice if we can provide them with that. If they can always ask us any questions. This is quite a technical legal matter. It might be a bit difficult to understand at first how the different diplomatic processes work in New York. So we hope to be able to provide you and your local, your national, your regional campaign with information and resources. We have legal advisors, we have people with loads of experience in diplomatic spaces. So if we don't have the answer, we'll try to go and find them for you. And there are different ways how you can organize your national campaign. There are a couple of aims that each group will focus on just to make sure that we're coherent and we're all fighting for the same goal, which is the advisory opinion on climate change and human rights. We have a couple of different focus areas that groups can really dive into. It's important for us that you put pressure on states, but we want local groups to be able to decide whatever makes the most sense in their local context. So who does that make sense to contact first? Who might be strategic allies to help you? There are loads of different ways to put pressure on decision makers. In the Pacific, which is where this initiative was first started, it had worked very well, and a group of university students managed to put so much pressure on Pacific leaders that they decided they would like to take this forward and table this resolution in New York. So it can work very well, and we would like to empower you to decide whatever makes sense in your context. We also hope that local groups will mobilize different civil society groups. There are so many groups out there working on climate action and trying to make the planet a little bit greener. So we'd encourage you to reach out to these different groups and network with them. There are lots of groups that work on human rights issues. Get those involved too. Try to build a big network of support, youth groups, but also other groups, adults with many years of experience organizing and working in this field. And of course, what we are really trying to do is connect human rights and climate change. We want to get away from this picture where it's maybe just a polar bear suffering from climate change and the crisis that we're really in, and really draw the connection to human rights and to how human rights are already violated today. So in any way, shape, or form that you think makes sense for people in your communities to really understand and be able to amplify that message that human rights and climate change are connected. You are encouraged to start any kind of creative campaign or action that you can think of that would draw attention to the connection of climate change and human rights. You can do this by, for example, collecting evidence. So Aoife spoke about how victims and witnesses are allowed sometimes at the WYCJ in The Hague to give a witness statement. And there's so many climate crisis witnesses out there already. We are trying to collect their stories to be able to provide the court with such an overwhelming amount of evidence that it's impossible for them to ignore the reality that we're already in. You can organize summer courses, get law students involved, get people involved to work on human rights issues, policy issues, politics. And then there is a campaign called Friends of the Initiative. So we are trying to recruit as many organizations, individuals, groups that would publicly endorse our campaign. We would put them on the website, on social media. They can help us with whatever kind of support they are willing to give. And we would like to encourage you to reach out to local groups and local individuals who can become our Friends of the Initiative.
Cool. So we hope that this gives you an overview of the World's Youth for Climate Justice and our mission to request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. And if you want any more information, please have a look at our website, WYCJ.org, and feel free to reach out to us if needed.
Mute. Thank you so much for your attention.